especially political historical writings. But he's not using it as in transforming for example, the poor mob or the poor rebel into the class of the proletarians. He uses it as an analytical term to analyze a certain group in society. And I just wonder, because I don't know if is that exactly Hegelian interpretation, or is it a Marxian way to kind of analyze a certain economic group, which is even more lower than the proletarian class? And I think it's really interesting to take it as an analytical tool, especially in these times where we have this Pöbelisierung der Gesellschaft, even more rebels, even more mob in society, especially regarding right-wing populist movements, etc., etc. No one is believing anymore in certain values we thought they are quite strong. So yeah, I wonder if you can say more about it. I think it's really interesting. One more thing, in the 18th primaire, there's really important how Marx is talking about the poor mob or the poor rebel, because he thinks that's the army of the fascists or the army of the authoritarian regime actually, and they have no class view at all.
Yes.
So.
No, you're right. I mean, there is this, of course, the famous distinction, which sort of, I think, is kind of anticipated in Hegel between proletariat and Lumpenproletariat. And the Lumpenproletariat, I mean, there are these readings that basically say, well, they must be cooler because they're lower than the lowest, right? But Marx's point is fundamentally different from that. The Lumpenproletariat are those, I mean, I think that's literally Marx, are those elements who are thrown into the revolutionary movement and simply want a reconstitution of the previous bourgeois position. They just want to get their share. So they align themselves with the emancipatory collective action, but only to reconstitute their position in the society of that they would like if they were a part of it. Right? So it is the reactionary elements, and the early Marx, for example, in the early text on the wooden laws, right, on the Holzdiebstahlgesetz, there, I mean, I traced it only to up to the Marx of 1844, actually, the economic philosophical manuscript of 43-44. And of course, Pöbel is a pejorative verb, refers to the French peuple, people, that's le bas peuple, that's a lower kind of people. So it has this, let's say, both this universal dimension and at the same time indicates a concrete position. Right? So everyone can become poor, that's Hegel's claim, and everyone who is poor can become a rebel. They just need a conviction that they think this system's unjust. So in this sense, right, this concrete position is linked because everyone can become poor, and thus everyone is latently poor, potentially poor, and everyone who became poor can form that conviction. There is a universality inscribed into this concrete position, so it's the position of concrete universal, as you will, if you wish. The early Marx sees that, especially in the text on the wooden laws, where I think he affirmatively refers to the rebel, but to the pöbel, but he also often, and I would say more frequently, uses the pöbel only in a pejorative sense.
More or less.
Yeah, when he talks. Particularly, and I'm still unclear. I was unable to find out where that came from, because in the lecture transcripts of Hegel's late lectures on the philosophy of rights, there are right now 4 volumes in German existing of just like pupils and students sitting in his class. Someone introduced, and I'm entirely unclear if it was the editor. I mean, it doesn't seem to come from the editor, but from someone, but I don't know if it was the guy who, inter alia, Eduard Ganz, who did the manuscript. Someone, precisely in the passage where Hegel starts to talk about the rebel, basically says the class of the, like a header, right, of that section headline, the capitalist and the proletariat. That's someone indicated. And either it was a Marxist editing the manuscripts, right, and thought, okay, that's the anticipation, or Hegel used that, which is weird because otherwise he doesn't. Out of nowhere, so, or it was, whatever, it is there, right? In the last two not manuscript, but in the lecture notes, right? I mean, that his students wrote. So people, somewhat at least, let's put it like that, was aware of that kind of connection. Because it's only that in the lecture notes, not in the official text that Hegel published, that the reference to the rich rebel emerges. And in the outlines of the philosophy, right, he only talks about the rebel in the sense of the poor rebel. The poor, basically, cutting all social ties. It's a phenomenon of asociality. And I was very interested of linking asociality and politicality. Because that's a very anti-Aristotelian idea. And only in the lectures he at one point says that the rich rebel is indicated or is determined by a self-understanding of civil society and its economy as a gigantic gamble. It's just all is a gamble. And in the moment some rich person wins in that gamble, in that game, it immediately generates the rich rebel attitude. That one does not need to work to subsist. That one doesn't need others. That economy works for us, or something works for them. Right? And so someone saw that this attitude is somehow describing the self-understanding of the average capitalist. But I don't know where that came from, and I don't know how much Marx was aware of that. So I'm trying to construct a different transition, sort of, that the Marxian proletariat is basically a politicized version of the rebel, of the poor rebel. And the division between the rich and the poor rebel is basically pre-structuring the class struggle of capitalists and the working class. Conceptually, I mean, that's what it is. That Hegel sort of anticipated that already. And just like one last sentence, Andrew Kutrofellow wrote, and I didn't think of that, but he wrote a very nice review of something I wrote, and he started by saying, since he understood, or when he read the book on the rebel, he was anticipating the rich rebel actually to become more prominent in the contemporary field of politics, and finally with Trump, the moment around. I mean, so, and I didn't think of that, but he just like linked the rich rebel and Trump, and it sort of makes sense.
Yeah, it also fits to Bonapartism perfect.
Yes, perfect.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Could you perhaps say that the Tout in Hegel is an abstract asociality, while the proletariat class, at least that's self-conscious in Marx, is a concrete asociality, in the sense that the Hegelian building is opposed to society as such and kind of any kind of coming together, while the proletariat is opposed to this specific form, but it's the opposite of opposed for well, a free communion of free subjects or yes.
Yes, I mean, yeah. I mean, in a sense, of course, it appears, and Hegel describes the poor rebel constantly by a long series of negations. He or she negates the concept of duties. Because how can a society command me to do anything if it's just like a concatenation of injustice? Therefore, he or she refutes the very concept of right and everything. So that seems to be a very abstract negation, but nonetheless, it's, I think, important that this abstract negation appears at a very concrete place in the economic system that is civil society. Right? Anyone can just like lose the job, become poor, and then form a certain kind of attitude, basically saying this society is unjust per se. That does not necessarily entail the claim that all society is. It's simply, and weirdly, Hegel seems to be indicating, he doesn't elaborate that, but he seems to be indicating the poor rebel is correct. I mean, he or she measures civil society according to its own principles that it cannot sustain and maintain. Right? So somehow he or she is taking civil society at its word and sees all the violations that are structurally embedded and realized in it, and hence has this is why I'm saying that, has a concrete reason to abstractly negate. Right? So I think there is a dialectics of concreteness and abstraction. Right? So it's a very concrete position, which nonetheless appears like a weird abyss of negativity within there. And of course, what Marx's interest that would be was what I was trying to insinuate. Marx's interest is how to organize that, because it's completely clear, and this is why I said it's asocial, that they're not organized. The poor rebel indicates just a place in the system, which is not per se active. I mean, it's a kind of passivity. They simply refuse, like a structural bottom. I prefer not to, and only in a more aggressive way. Right? But this only, and this is important, only holds for the poor rebel, because it has this kind of universal dimension, whereas the rich rebel has a, let's say, a reified universal dimension, because if for the poor rebel holds, everyone can become poor, and every poor can become a rebel, forming this conviction that everything is unjust. For the rich rebel, this doesn't hold, because everyone can become rich, brackets, who gains something on the market without laboring, and everyone who gains something on the market without laboring, which is just a few, not all, will be the rich rebel. And so it's like a particularization of that everyone universal language. One gets a bit, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to get back. I'm trying to wrap my head around fatalism and the understanding of predestination. Because from what I gather, and I really enjoyed your presentation, by the way, both of you, but it seems to me that the task of philosophy is to prepare for the event for which one cannot prepare. But yet there is a task here of critique of some way, of the philosophical tradition that is, from my understanding of your reading Marx, it is through the paths of thought that have pre-dated this particular, but not in a sense of an enlightened subject that is conscious or that operates with certainty, but built in the whole notion of the uncertainty, or through moving through the kinds of the modes of thought or the paths of thought where things do not appear as such, yet may contain that force of transformation or a transformative force that in some way or another will appear then again? That's my question. Is it the reading practice of critique that will somehow, by intersecting it with other fields of practice, be it civil society or art or whatever, that might in some way or another unleash or make appear, or not by intention, perhaps more by accident, some kind of transformative event. But then my question is, because is a notion that there is always an historical element in not only in the path of thinking, but also in the different fields of practice where these intersections may occur, where there is always something that is historically marked or in time or place. And I don't know, in your notion of necessity or fatalism, is there a notion of some kind of necessity and an ancient ananke, or that is basically that time, that marking of time, that is not necessarily intended or consciously sought, yet may appear. I don't know, there's something in that which I found very alluring, and yet there's still that hearkening back to a certain, I dare not mention the name, but a sort of a Heideggerian reading of that which does not appear in Kant, is what in his rereading, that is somehow a new reading will appear, let something appear that did not appear before. And I don't know, does any of this make sense to you? I'm just trying to grapple with what you actually understand by this fatalism or predestination.
I mean, let's put it like that. I took my cue from a remark that Hegel once made apropos of Luther, where he said, I think it's also in the beginning of the philosophy, right, where he said, modern philosophy has only the task to articulate in the medium of the concept what Luther expressed in the medium of feeling and sentiment. And what is the crucial feeling or sentiment in Luther? Anxiety. That is the most crucial sentiment that you find. Anxiety being faced with a God to whom one cannot relate, whom one cannot understand. And the only proper way for Luther to not be blasphemic, this is, for example, his fight with Erasmus, but I would say this also distinguishes Luther from Calvin and the Calvinist, is to radically accept God's unknowability and the unknowability of his or her plans. Right? I mean, because otherwise, this is what he attacks Erasmus for, we have to presuppose God is good, God constantly cares for us, God can be described in the ways in which we would describe just another human being. And that's blasphemy for Luther. So Luther starts by saying, one has to radically affirm that there, let's put it like that, is no relation between God and man. No relation, because we would not even know how to conceptualize it. Something which I think also shows that there is a certain, let's say, Protestant heritage to psychoanalysis, right? Which cares a lot for conceptualizing the non-relation between male and female conditions. So, but this is Luther's answer, but produce anxiety. Why? Because whatever I think I'm in control of, I'm not. I cannot choose to believe. This is what he attacks Erasmus. Right? Erasmus says, God is good, he cooperates with us, and even after the primordial sin, he constantly makes offers to make us better. Right? There is some human divine cooperationism in Erasmus. Right? Let's put it like that. For Luther, this is not capitalism as religion, but religion as capitalism. Right? I mean, it sounds nice, and we just have to make a lot of effort, and then, right? I mean, salvation will come because God sees he's a good guy. He just wants proper, as it were, employees, right, who are constantly active and engaged. And Luther says this is blasphemic because I can never start to properly understand what God is if I don't accept that I cannot understand what God is. And this puts me in a state of sheer anxiety, the abyss of anxiety. That's the anxiety of being, this is, I think, why he, this famous quotes about the status, the experimental status of human being, right? Man is a piece of shit that fell from God's anus. I mean, that's the kind of humanism you get there, right? An inhumanism or whatsoever. And this is assuming this position as experimental. Having nothing, just having nothing in our power. Not even under control when I start believing or falling in love. That's an analogy Luther sometimes even himself draws. It means the first feeling of accepting that, the first sentiment, is anxiety. It sort of makes you aware of your own incapacity, which is the prerequisite, precondition for finding freedom in faith. That's Luther's claim. If that is serious, if that is what one can decipher in Luther, what does that mean to introduce that into a conceptual elaboration in philosophy? That's sort of the question I raised. Right? What does it mean to articulate a philosophy of anxiety? A philosophy which is fundamentally
Kierkegaard
anxious.
tried.
Of course, yes, of course. I mean, Hegel says in the beginning of the Science of Logic at one point, Kant's philosophy is great, but, and it sounds like a criticism, but I think it's ultimately a praise, but Kant was anxious with regard to the object. What object? The object of thought, that moves thought. This anxiety, I think this is Hegel's claim somehow, Kant was the first to somehow introduce this anxiety in front of that weird object which forces us to think into philosophy. That was Kant's greatness, but then he shielded that anxiety off and tried to administer it properly and so forth. And I think what Hegel, this is why he, for me, is the worst. And if you take a look at traditional readings and criticisms of Hegel, I mean, he competes maybe with Plato, but right, I mean, he was for a long time, I mean, like, the culprit of all philosophical crimes, right? Reason in history, end of art, all these stuff, right, which no one likes. Think of Popper, right, one of the totalitarians, and all that, defended monarchy, necessity of war, right? I mean, you have all the things one wants to avoid. You find them in Hegel. So somehow, what I would argue, and this is why Hegel is for me what I call the absolute fatalist, right? Because he tries to elaborate a concatenation of the very concept of the absolute and of a weird kind of fatum. Which, and this is, that we first need God to, in the next, assume that there is a God and a plan. I mean, this is why I think that it's basically like an analysis, as if Hegel were psychoanalysis before psychoanalysis in a certain sense. I mean, he shows that we cannot simply get rid of our reference to the other, but we need to accept that the other is him or herself barred, right, impotent, and so forth. But how to do that? First, we need to accept that there is predestination. Then we see that the only predestination that there is that there is no predestination, but a God which can only predestine everything, in a way that he cannot predestine anything, is no God. And thereby, by traversing our own assumption that there is predestination, we get to the point where we see God is just an idiot as us, and thus no God. I mean, he's incapable, him or herself, which then, of course, necessarily produces anxiety, because then we're the only ones responsible. But I think, I mean, that's the idea. This detour is necessary, and this is a crucial part of the fatalism. Right? This detour that we cannot simply say, okay, let's get rid of God and our belief in whatsoever. This is sort of a necessary prerequisite, and this is why philosophy, one could say, just reminds us of what we already know, but don't know that we know.
But does this relate to what Aldo said and Zizek, I think? I think it comes from Deleuze, like that. One of the best things of materialism is that it does address to the questions. You know, so like rephrasing the problems. How does philosophy prepare for the event? I think you can draw this from Althusser's philosophy of the, what is that? Encounter, yeah. Because he there identifies four procedures which are the same as you remember? Of Badiou. So he says philosophy depends on historical materialism, which is science for him, politics, culture, and something. So art is culture, and so but the four procedures are there, and then he goes on with an elaboration of restructuring the problems, asking the right ones. a thesis which is now published in non-philosophy book.
Mm-hmm.
No, just stay in my mind what you said, like task of philosophy is to prepare for the event which is known.
I mean, somehow, let's put it like that, the answer I just tried to give sounds like a cheap answer, actually, right? How to prepare for that for which one cannot prepare? Just recall what you know that you don't know. I mean, really, which is the hardest thing to do. I mean, that's the whole big, I mean, right, Freud in the introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, that's the basic definition of the unconscious, the knowledge that you don't know that you have. You don't know that you, I don't know, hate your father or love your mother or both or whomever, but of course you somehow know that. And then the whole question is, how does such a knowledge become practically effective? Right? So that is, and this is why I think, let's say, this dimension of the Platonic analysis theory, right, of recalling what we sort of know, is very close to what Freud famously called remembering, repeating, working through. Right? I mean, we can remember certain things and talk about them. Certain things we cannot remember, and these are the things we repeat. Right? Sitting in front of our analyst, we behave, I don't know, shittily because he or she stands for an authority figure that we never like because it's daddy. Right? And working through, and this is the most tricky concept, because I mean, even that's quite wonderful in the text. I think it's the first time in the history of psychoanalysis that an analyst complains. Because in the text, Freud says, some analysts come to me and complain. They have the perfect interpretation, it doesn't work. So it's precisely the question I just said. Right? I mean, what does happen with the knowledge that we have, but which is nonetheless hindered from becoming practically effective? How does one deal with that? And Freud's answer is working through, durcharbeiten. And the short version of it, and it's a tricky thing, Freud says, well, it takes time. Some things need time. But this time is not like measurable objective. It's not like, right, I mean, you have the right interpretation, no, wait for 2 weeks.
So what does philosophy do today when there is no, at least fault? You know? That's why I think that this thing that I think I'll just say Zizek and like redefining the problems. Not that it will bring the event, you know? But
I mean, think for example, one last thing, I told you this earlier, because I mean, Zizek sometimes used this joke. Namely, a guy in Stalinist Russia is sent to the Gulag, and he tells his friends, I know that there will be censorship and everything, I will write you letters and everything that I actually mean, I write in blue ink, and everything that I don't mean the way I write it in red ink. So he's sent to the Gulag, they receive the first letter, and it's basically, wow, dear comrades, it's wonderful here. The weather is perfect, all the work, I feel healthy, the food is great, everyone is nice, the only thing missing is red ink. And right, and Slavoj's point is sometimes the very language to articulate a criticism or whatsoever can be missing. Right? And my version of that is then use the language of, because certain terms don't have, let's say, are not really in fashion, but they can be used to make up a, let's say, red ink vocabulary. And one of them, I mean, one of them is for, this is why, I mean, I didn't invent it, I mean, Descartes used it, and it's the Schmidt guy and so forth. This is why I opted for fatalism. Because, I mean, no one in their right mind would immediately say, yeah, yes, I'm a fatalist too. Right? I mean, Badiou's example is discipline. Right? Who is for discipline? It doesn't sound that nice. Slavoj always flirts with endorsing a strict police regime. Believe, right? And stuff like that. So I'm taking that itself as an analytic gesture.
Ja, okej, bara snabb.
For a law.
No, I was thinking because you talk so much about philosophy, and of course, because you're philosophers, I'm not
philosophers tend to do that, yeah, I agree.
No, and then we talk about a lot of knowledge, like in philosophy and knowledge, and what do we know, and how should we know, and kind of reach another kind of knowledge, knowing what we don't know, or but I was just wondering, because I also like to pitch Zizek and Spivak up against each other. And I also really like that idea that it's not a question about what you know or how you know, but how you imagine that which you know. And for her, that is also a way of kind of like thinking change, like thinking change through changing desires. And that's what art does, and that's what literature does. It's not kind of like a knowledge production, knowing things, but it's how you imagine that what you already know in different ways. So I was wondering if you could say something about maybe like if philosophy and art or philosophy and literature are in the same project here, that it's kind of the end is the same, or maybe even fatalism could also be not a way of just kind of acknowledging, but also a way of imagining that which you know, or how art and literature plays into that.
Can I say something before you answer, Guy? Yeah, I was thinking about something. I don't know if it is the same, but since you were talking about the task of the philosopher, I was thinking about asking Agon if he had something to say, thinking about Pasolini and his very intense political life, and how would you talk about then the task of the artist and how that relates with what I said previously.
You could think of Pasolini in philosophical terms, but ultimately I think that his work was he practically claimed that after the war Italy didn't go through the process of the fascicization, how do you call it? So he claimed that the consumerist culture, which was installed since the 60s, was practically replacing fascism. He then went on to collaborate and to work with. Maybe this is interesting, with the poor but not proletarian, but lumpen proletarian of the suburbs, mostly of the suburbs of Rome. And I think with fascism, in a way, the problem of fascism and his critique dominates throughout his films. The last one being Salo, which is like a remake of Desade's 120 Days. Whatever the title is. I think that, for instance, unlike Althusser, and more closely to Badiou, I think, Pasolini was a communist without a party. You know, I think Lenin uses this term somewhere. He thought that. One of the most important aspects to it was preserving the local cultures and dialects within the Italian language. He at one point certainly probably even gave up on organized politics and on Marxism. Apparently, there are some texts on his lectures on Christianity and Marxism, where he, as it seems, he gives up on Marxism and says it's hopeless. All what we can do is, I haven't read them because they're being translated now, but the translator just sent me some paragraphs, which makes sense if you think of his political activity. He gave up on transforming the present, and that all what we can do is make these small local call them communes or what you like with the poor or lumpen proletariat of the suburbs of mostly Rome. However, it's a paradoxical position because for him the grace is doesn't have a theological dimension, but the grace comes from the struggle of the poor, of that class or subclass against the contemporary fascism, which is the consumer society. But I think many things will be, not many things, but we'll have a different idea of the part of life where he gives up apparently on the organized politics. One this, it's practically a long text, like 60 pages, like on him abandoning Marxism. But if I'm to say something which I don't agree with myself, you just have to give an example. One of the biggest critiques of Badiou is that he, I think Tony Nagel wrote this, a communist without, what's the name of the text?
As a communist without being Marxist.
Without being a Marxist. I think that was the case of Pasolini, but I think at the end, at his last years of his life, he wasn't even a communist anymore, but something, just trying to preserve the local dialects and these forms of life in the suburbs of a big city. I fear he told that transforming revolution, socialism back then, communism, are simply impossible.
Fatalism. The fatalism in practice.
Maybe, yeah. Just to add to your question, I mean, it depends a bit on whose side one wishes to be. I always found it very convincing, I have to say, to basically say that art is able to, and that sounds Heideggerian, even though I mean it differently, but I mean, that's what you claim. Art is actually able to produce truth. Philosophy isn't. I mean, there is true art. There is no true philosophy. In this sense, right? It articulates truth claims. And this is why, I mean, in a sense, and I think this is already, in one way or the other, Hegel's thesis, the history of philosophy shows that philosophy is weirdly repetitive. I mean, Hegel thought what he's articulating is still what is right or correct in Plato, but it's not about concrete statements, right? I mean, I mean, it's the same movement. So this is why one can write a history of philosophy, and it's not that constantly the claims are renewed. The means by which certain claims, under historically specific conditions, must be reiterated and changed. Right? Because something can happen outside of philosophy that drastically forces philosophy to alter its claims. But philosophy itself sort of reacts to what happens outside of it. I mean, the owl of Minerva, right? So it only begins its flight when the day falls to dusk. I think that is still, even cliche, quite appropriate definition of philosophy, or when philosophy begins. And one should not forget that the weirdness of Marx's last Feuerbach thesis, right, that philosophers only interpreted the world thus far, the point is to change it. Almost all philosophers wanted to change it. I mean, read Plato, read Hume, read Hobbes, read whatever, right? They make one of the very few who didn't was Hegel. He always said, I mean, it's not normative accountants that I'm not telling you what to do, I'm just describing what is. In the moment where it's about to collapse, I mean, because otherwise I couldn't. Right? I mean, day turned to dusk. So the state Hegel's depicting is about to end. So it's good news to read that book. But I would say if that is philosophy, artistic practices can actually do something else. Produce something true. Which is why, for example, I don't know, if I force my students to read Sophocles or whatsoever, and even though the historical setting is completely unintelligible for them whatsoever, they're touched by that. It somehow affects them still. There is still something to that. But whereas if you do that with a philosopher, somehow it's at least different. So what I'm trying to say, in art, something trans-temporal can emerge, right? Which exceeds the historical limitations of the context and so forth. This is why Antigone still says something. And I think that's not in the same sense true for philosophy. But I think that is good news for philosophy, because thereby, I mean, these people engaged in that, I mean, are not simply purely thinking themselves, right, and emptily circulating around themselves, but have objects. Not simply art objects, but what is happening in arts, which has such transcendental quality. And this certainly can have an effect on, let's say, well, let's put it like that, just like one said, and then it's difficult to say where precisely, what kind of imagination, where precisely to place the concept of imagination, because something like philosophical imagination must sort of look different, let's put it like that, from artistic imaginations. Right? If this distinction, which I just made between the operations and the practice of philosophy and the practice of art are convincing, or is convincing, then imagination must mean something else there, I would say.
What you just said now, in terms of how you perceive of truth, then I take it that in as much as art can produce something true or truth, it has to pertain in some way to, in the medium of feeling or sensitivity, as you said it, or affect, whereas philosophy, you use the two mediums as the medium of the concept. So in that sense, truth, something that is conceptually true, philosophy is no longer able to produce, or even if it produces, it knows that it cannot, in a sense. Yet, what would be if you say that the philosophical imagination, of course, can do through the reworking or the working through of philosophical texts or concepts or whatever, something may emerge from that, especially as it merges with practices in other fields, be it artistic or in society, in politics or whatever. But what exactly is the status of affect or sentiment or feeling in this? Because in a sense, historically, of course, philosophy has tried to shy away from the notion of feeling. Spinoza as an exception, and others. But for Deleuze, for instance, art is a block of affect. And so how do you see the workings of let's say, the philosophical imagination in relation to the artistic imagination? Because they seem to be dealing in different media. Or how do you think about this?
No, yeah, I mean, shall I, or do you want to?
I'll jump in.
I've witnessed a lot of time in, let's say, rather conservative philosophical departments, that art is all about feeling and philosophy is all about conceptual thinking. Which is another way of saying that the men do the latter, that the women do the former. That is somehow weirdly, at least in my experience, the prejudice, right? If you're interested in art, you're more into feeling. But if you're interested in philosophy, you need rock solid arguments. Right? I think, and I try to indicate that briefly, but not conceptually yet, that any kind of transformation, let's put it like that. First, what I mean by truth is something that is articulating, expressing, manifesting a consequence of a transformation. So I'm not saying a claim as such is truth, but a certain kind. I'm describing with that a certain kind of practice, very, very much close with but you would indicate. And if any kind of transformation to be fundamental transformation is somehow linked to anxiety, the most, from my perspective, I mean, if I were a Lacanian, I would more strongly argue that there is only one affect. That is anxiety. Right? That's already Kierkegaard's claim, in a sense. But structurally, I think, if a transformation somehow, if something happening in art or politics somehow, has consequences and it thus gains a certain consistency, it always has to do something, at least that I can say, with anxiety. Right? And I would say that then, because anxiety is incapacitating somehow. If you're in a state of anxiety, right, you cannot act. Right? So I would argue that it is a working with anxiety, right? Very much as in analysis. Sometimes you need to come very close to something that makes you anxious, and then it is productive. Sometimes very close is too close, and then, right? I mean, and then I would argue, and it's very specific what you name that kind of, specific to the different fields of practice, what term I would assign to that working with anxiety. Hegel's term for that is courage. It's a very old term that was invented by Plato. And it's, when he tries to answer what is courage, he ends up saying, well, we need a definition of philosophy, the world, and everything else to explain what is courage. Because it's so difficult, because it involves sort of all other concepts, right, of practice, of rationality, and so on. So in a sense, but you suggested, and I'm not convinced, let me put it like forms of practice, yet I wouldn't see why one should refrain from claiming that anxieties, if one links affects to transformations, to a fundamental restructuring of everything, of one's own conception of the world, of one's own self-understanding, why that should not necessarily also, or why that should prevent one from endorsing the claim that anxiety is the one affect which constitutively is involved there. So I would say, if you're a philosopher, that's I think what you would argue. To be a philosopher, one has to have felt this kind of anxiety at least once outside of philosophy. Otherwise, you cannot really properly philosophize. This doesn't mean, for example, that you're outside of philosophy simply in the realm of feeling, but involved in a different sense field of practice. And if what I said earlier with regard to Hegel's claim that Kant introduced anxiety into philosophy, I think philosophy proper is a working through with that one affect. Because, if anxiety doesn't indicate anything, if one would say anxiety only indicates one thing, it indicates the non-necessity of everything that is. This is what is. If you truly believe that things are non-necessary the way that they are, including yourself, your position, the universe, whatsoever, right? That's not only an abyss of thought, but brings you very close to freedom and transformation and all that stuff. Right? That's already Kierkegaard's argument. So in a sense, philosophy, I would say, works with anxiety. But differently, once again, because it does not produce something true, differently than I would say in art or politics or whatsoever. Was that an answer?
Sure. Interesting answer.
Did I present very interesting? No, please. No, just like you said, I was thinking again of yourselves in this transformation, because first you think that art is interesting, but it cannot be elevated to the level of critique of ideology. But then later on, he claims that because of its abstraction, it can produce knowledge, which is again interesting because it goes much after his definition of philosophy as a theory of theoretical practice. But I don't buy this, neither the first nor the former. I think Badiou's understanding of it as a truth procedure is far more pertinent.
I mean, Hegel has this, maybe that's sort of, but I mean, this is always attributed to Hegel, but I think he never said that explicitly like that, but I like the invented quote more than what he actually says. So, he at one point, he seems to be saying, and Slavoj rephrased that in this way, that the riddles of the ancient Egyptians were riddles for the ancient
He
Egyptians
says that
themselves.
actually in the philosophy of history. It's a quote from Hegel.
But does he really say it?
Yeah, yes.
I think the latter part isn't there, actually.
No, yes, it is there.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. One of that's good news. I always thought, like, damn, such a beautiful comment. And then even that's good news. Okay. So in a sense, right? This also holds, I think, in a way for artistic productions. I mean, that's what Hegel shows in his philosophy of art. Right? The Egyptians didn't know why the fuck they built the pyramids. They built the pyramids, and then they started to write reflecting. But and then it's important that this, let's say, this materialized riddle is historically specific, right? I mean, the riddles of the Egyptians are not the riddles of the Romantics or whatever. But what exceeds, in a certain sense, and this is why I thought the distinction between truth and knowledge is quite pertinent here. If that is true, right? That even the Egyptians struggled with why they built the pyramids. There is something that is of relevance in their cultural, artistic activity that exceeds knowledge. And this is what is transhistoric. And the classical philosophical term for precisely that is that which is not knowledge epistemically true. And so the truth of an epoch, I would say, certainly generates new knowledge. We know a lot of things about the pyramids, or Goethe, or whatever you wish, right? I mean, it generates knowledge, but it can never, I would say, and that's, I think, already, it can never be fully absorbed into knowledge, which is why there is a weird comic dynamic, which is why then Hegel's whole statics, comics, and comedy, which is making that kind of weird, let's say, dynamic itself into the structural principle and into the content of comedies themselves, at least modern comedies.
And that's also Supavchic's argument in his book on yes. But would you say that that is precisely the working of the spirit? Well, it tries to find itself in the material world, in the substance, and it doesn't. But that's when it search for itself after the split is what generates each epoch and with its qualities. So therefore, you can say, well, the great enigma of the Egyptian culture, etc., is an enigma for us, but it was also for the Egyptians, and that is precisely what is, well, the effort of the Egyptian culture, etc. But perhaps you can link that to your point about the predestination, that, well, you have to presuppose predestination and then you have to work through it. It's like you sort of work through the fantasy that there actually is a kind of predestination. When you have worked through that, wouldn't you say that that would be the moment in the Hegelian philosophy when you reach Christianity? Well, that's sort of the birth of modernity in a certain sense. This recognition that Hegel writes about, that, well, God is actually dead, and he recognizes it himself. That on the cross, it's not only God's Son who dies, but also this Father, whatever you say, is also the recognition that the objective, transcendent God, is also dead. So after that, you have sort of the secular, modern elaboration of, well, the society that we now are living in, so to speak. The question was, in order to try to link what you said about fatalism with your presentation, that about the necessity or the utility of thinking Marxism, communism in terms of Christianity, because that's at least in your abstract for tomorrow, or was it in one of the articles, that you suggest that, well, the link between liberation, communism, and Christianity is one of your views.
Well, yes.
And you touched upon that when you talked about
I wrote that apropos what you said because I was working a little bit on the liberation theology tradition in Latin America, and it was very interesting because during the military juntas there and afterwards, the only force which was able to organize the poor, the workers, both the proletarian and the peasants, and most of the peasants were the liberation theology guys. So very traditional societies, very religious. So Marxism could not penetrate into those areas, or at least that's how the argument of the Leonardo Boff guy goes. You know, like this Brazilian liberation theology guy. My point was not that Marxism is a secularized version of Christianity, but what are the fundamentals of Christianity which can be realized, as Althusser said, only through communism. Universality, fraternity, equality, if you like. Also that would be really problematic to include equality into the communist hypothesis. I think there is that dimension of religion, which is which I think universality can be thought through Christianity. Okay, there is another dimension of it in Islam, but that's much more complicated through Ummah and stuff. But that's practically my point. Liberation in some parts and up to a point can come through realizing the fundamentals of Christianity. The famous St. Paul's thing: they're neither Jews nor Greeks nor men nor women. So I think this we can think through Christianity.
And maybe I agree. Yes, somehow the move is not to say God is that, but to make God Himself admit that He doesn't exist. Right? I mean, this is, and I think this is what I said earlier with regard to what I think Hegel shows everywhere, but also in the philosophy of history. At the end of the philosophy of history, at the end of history, as it were, one encounters somehow a God which admits, hey, I don't exist. And this is necessary, because everything else is a detour of avoiding that insight. But then things, I think, get quite charmingly, or one can find the structural implications of that if one reads. I was working on that because I recently finished a book with Rebecca Comey, which is about to come out on the phenomenology and the science of logic, on their weird relation, if it is one. And Hegel says in the beginning of the science of logic, usually the standard reading is, okay, what does the phenomenology do? It's the introduction to the system. What does this introduction do? It gets rid of all presuppositions that we have, all the assumptions that we made with regard to what is freedom. Right? So the science of logic shows us what all the crap we need to think if we want to have a proper understanding of freedom. The phenomenology is just like something we need to digest, just like to clear the slate. Something. And the epitome of clearing the slate is absolute knowing. But it's very weird. In the beginning of the science of logic, Hegel says at one point, absolute knowing is so pure, it ceases to be itself. So it disappears. Absolute knowing is such a pure knowledge that doesn't stand in any external relationship to an object, but has itself as its own object only, and knows that it has to clear the slate fundamentally. So it needs to get rid of all presupposition for a proper presuppositionless science, such that in the end, we are left with not even nothing. So we get rid of all the presuppositions under phenomenology, and in the end, what needs to, not only all presuppositions need to disappear, but the process of disappearance of all presuppositions itself has to disappear. This is what happens when absolute knowing ceases to be what it is. So where are we? Right? I mean, what is that weird space which for Hegel is the precondition to think? And which he dramatically but wonderfully describes as this is what the science of logic does, right? Depicting God's thought before the creation of the world and finite mind. So if there ever was a megalomaniac book, right, God's thoughts before the creation, it is that book. But where is God before the creation? What is that weird place? And Hegel says, and this is where sort of my fatalism comes in, Hegel quotes Horaz there. Namely a passage where, just like 2 sentences, where Horaz says, if the world crumbles, a piece of stone will hit the hero. And so if everything falls apart, even the last man standing will fall too. This is sort of the precondition. So in a sense, and this is not the last line which I very willfully stole from him, and he knows that, that somehow when thought begins, the apocalypse always already happened. So it's not something on the horizon, but somehow everything collapsed. There is not even nothing to cling to. And then the sun is falling. So in this sense, I would argue, this is a kind of, let's say, this is the kind of absolute fatalism which is, let's say, the corresponding position to a God who has to admit that he doesn't exist. This is what follows from that. It follows, weirdly, a radical responsibility of all.